Now, this video is all about keeping it real. Real fake. Hey everyone, this is John from EastCoastArmory.com, and I'm here today with a model showcase video for this 1/35th scale Academy Minicraft M48A3 Patton tank. The model in this video is built for my own personal collection and is not for sale and or purchase. However, like I often mention in these build videos, I frequently take on commission build projects from models ranging between 1/35th scale and 1/6 scale. For availability and pricing information, that information would be best by contacting me through the email address listed below, which is info@eastcoastarmory.com. This model here is built predominantly out of the box. However, besides the usual detail tweaks and mods that I make to the exterior detailing, this model here has also been modified further because it was converted from static display to fully motorized. We'll be going over all this information in this video, as well as reviewing the base starter kit, so stay tuned because there's going to be a ton of info flying right at you. To get this video started, let's go ahead and take a quick walk around this model. And this vehicle is the M48A3 Patton. As many of us know, the M48 was the very first generation of main battle tanks that were designed by the US military back in the early 1950s. When the vehicle was first designed and was first fielded, the vehicle utilized the power pack of a V12 Continental gasoline engine. As production ramped up and as the decade proceeded, a few upgrades were made to the vehicle, resulting in the M48A1 as well as the M48A2. Some of these redesigns were minute, like the redesign of the bow headlight cluster, but some proved to be a little bit more expansive, like the complete replacement of the commander's cupola with the new redesigned mini turret. Other features were made in order to improve the tank's efficiency, and most of these changes came from in-field feedback. For instance, the vehicle originally had 5 return rollers, and this was dropped to 3, and the trailing idler was also deemed to be unnecessary and was another feature that tend to have been replaced on newer vehicles. Probably the largest change, however, is with the M48A2, where the entire rear engine area was completely redesigned. In order to get better access, the barbecue slat-type grille, which is similar to the M46 Patton, which was found on the original M48 and A1, was utterly redesigned to the larger capacity type engine bay, which is seen on vehicles that came after the M48 family. By the end of the 1950s, the US military was mostly content with their M48A2s. However, it was deemed that the power plant was probably the weakest part of the whole vehicle. The vehicle being gasoline powered does have some drawbacks. First and foremost, the vehicles are very thirsty, and this does limit the vehicle's overall range. The engine being gasoline powered can lend itself to some mechanical issues, but the last problem is that if the vehicle gets hit, it has a really bad tendency to flare up and catch on fire. In the late 1950s, it was deemed to look for another power source in order to propel the vehicle. After some research and development, the military decided to settle on a diesel engine. The engine that was chosen was the Continental AVDS 1790 V12 twin-turbo air-cooled diesel engine. This engine was proven to be a very good engine and carried over into the tank designs that came after the M48, namely, of course, the M60. This new vehicle was going to be designated the M48A3, and it was going to be a conversion program that upgraded the older M48s, A1s, and some A2s into their A3 configuration. Because this was an upgrade program, the vehicles themselves stayed predominantly the same, outside, of course, the engine bay area as well as the engine revisions. The armament was the same, as well as the armor protection. The tank was still armed with the same 90mm main gun, the M2 HP50 caliber machine gun, as well as the M37, which was located in the coax position. What's also very interesting is that because the A3s were just upgraded versions of older tanks, you still had many older features found on the A3s, such things as the early pattern cage-type headlight cluster, as well as the number of return rollers. If the vehicle was originally an M48A1 that got upgraded, it kept the older headlights and the larger number of return rollers. But if the vehicle was an A2 that got upgraded, you're going to see the A2 features in these two locations found on the A3. By the time the A3 started to roll off the production line, the M48 Patton was really starting to look long in the tooth compared to some of the other Russian tanks of the period. It was at this point where the US military decided they needed a tank with a 105mm main gun, but rather than upgrading the M48s at this time, they decided to just come up with a brand new tank design, which would of course become the M60. By the early 1960s, it was deemed to replace the M48A3s that were in service with the US Armored Corps stationed in Western Europe. A large number of these vehicles, however, were then shipped off to Southeast Asia to take place in the Vietnam conflict. Although the tank was considered to be obsolete for Western Europe, it did have a renaissance in Southeast Asia. The vehicles that were sent to Vietnam performed very well, and the vehicle was very well received. The NVA hardly ever utilized their tanks for the duration of the war, and the few times that they did, when they encountered M48 Pattons, it didn't really end too well for them. Namely, of course, is the Battle of Ben Het. By the mid-1970s, the US military had officially pulled out of South Vietnam. When they did, they left a large number of their M48A3s behind, and these vehicles were then reabsorbed by the ARVN units. Eventually, in 1975, the entire country of South Vietnam collapsed, and when that happened, all of the M48A3s were then reabsorbed into the now unified communist government. These vehicles are still in existence today and are technically still in service with the Army of Vietnam. They are all mostly housed in a giant warehouse somewhere in the country, and if you've ever seen pictures of them, it looks a little strange because they have the North Vietnamese insignia painted on the turrets, and it just looks weird seeing a Patton in that configuration. It kind of looks like something from an old 80s action movie. Before we go any further with the video, let's go ahead and take a step back to when the model was first started to get a good idea on what the base starter kit supplies you with. And here's the model at the start of the build. For the base starter kit, I'll be utilizing this vintage 1/35 scale M48A3 Patton tank from Academy Minicraft. This model here is going to be very interesting for me to get on video, not so much for the subject matter itself being an M48A3 Patton, but the actual kit, because this kit here, as one can probably clearly see, is something that is a copy from something else. This kit here dates back to the late 1970s to the early 1980s time frame. During this time, Academy wasn't the plastic model company that we know of as today. During this period, they were really nothing more than a small-scale startup located in Seoul, South Korea. Being a small upstart company, they didn't exactly have a whole lot of money to invest in research and development to come up with their own new kits. So instead they did the next best thing, go ahead, take other kits that were on the market from other companies, make straight up copies of them, and sell them under their own name brand. Admittedly so, this is something that is extremely shady, but this is exactly what Academy did during this time frame and is basically what laid the foundation for what the company has developed into. Now, I can't exactly speak for their model airplane kits, but for their armor kits specifically, during this time, this was a rampant type of thing that Academy was doing. And specifically, the only kits that Academy were copying were the kits from Tamiya. I actually have an old 1980 Academy Minicraft catalog, and in that catalog, if you turn to the armor section, basically every single kit in there, in all different scales, were at one point released by Tamiya, be it 135, 148, and even 125th. In fact, if anyone's a fan of the channel, you'll note that this is not the first time an Academy Minicraft kit has come across my desk. A number of years ago, I completed a 148 scale motorized Jagdpanzer Kanone kit, which was originally Tamiya tooling and was a straight up copy by Academy. Now, Academy utilized this business model up through the late 70s into the early to mid 1980s. From the mid 80s and onward, Academy would start moving away from this type of business model and they would start developing kits with their own original tooling. More than likely, this was due to the sales that were coming in. With the added cash flow, this now allowed them to research and develop their own model kits. Specifically with the Academy armor kits, their second generation of kits did utilize some original Academy tooling, but they were really nothing more than polished and enhanced versions from the original Tamiya releases. This is seen on their M48A5 kit, which came out in the mid-1990s, as well as their M60A1 kit. In fact, on the ECA channel, I've recently completed several Tamiya and Academy renditions of the M60A1, and in those videos you can see exactly how much Academy took the original stock Tamiya tooling and further enhanced it, really improving a lot of the errors found on the Tamiya's tooling. Back to this model, however, during the original releases, Academy did release this model in several different formats, much similar to what was done in the 1970s by Tamiya, where you had one version that's motorized, another one that's wire remote, and another one that was eventually released as static. Well, in a similar format, Academy, when they first released this model, had a very fancy and eloquently made box art, and that model was released in a motorized and even a two-way wire remote format. Eventually, when Academy hooked up with Minicraft for the distribution, they stripped out the motorization feature and just offered the kit in a purely static format. And that is the version that we have here. However, one more thing I want to touch upon, and it's actually something that's quite interesting, is that when Tamiya first developed the M48A3 Patton kit, they originally had the intention to release it as a motorized model. However, for one reason or another, Tamiya never released this kit in a motorized format, either with a two-way wire remote or a single motorized gearbox system. But Academy, on the other hand, when they made their copy, they actually did release it in a motorized format, which is quite interesting, actually. When these kits were imported to the US, part of the allure to them was with their affordability. You do have basically the exact same tooling quality as found on the Tamiyas, with maybe slight degradation here or there, but by and large the kits were on par with what Tamiya was producing. However, these kits were at a fraction of the cost of the original Tamiya kits, which made them somewhat popular during this time frame. Starting with the graphic design, the Academy Minicraft kits are very, very, very low budget minded and are extremely simplistic. Unlike Tamiya, where you have that white background with the illustration of the vehicle, or even like with the older release of the Academy kits, have that nice fancy box art, on the Academy Minicraft kits, that's not the case. They all seem to have the same type of format, where we have a photograph of the kit that is just simply built and showcased on the box. I guess in a way you could say that is quite truthful and there's no fraud in advertising, because this is literally all of the contents supplied with the kit. The model itself is built quite average, I should say. Not great, not terrible, but you do notice that the individual who built this did have some difficulty with the kit supply markings, which is something I'll probably touch upon as the video progresses. And of course he made the rookie mistake of adding an external M2HB along with the internal M2HB in the commander's cupola. Something, again, I'll touch upon a little later. The remainder of the graphic design is as follows. We have this green little stripe that runs across. In Korean, we have the verbiage, and right here we have it in English. Here we have the logo. This is the old school Academy logo. This would go through different formats as time would progress. And Minicraft was the US importer for the Academy kits, and they were located in California. Minicraft would actually import the Academy kits into the US for a number of decades, only until recently Minicraft no longer has an agreement with Academy, and the current generation of Academy kits are being imported by MRC, who, as a side note, used to be the importer of the Tamiya kits from Japan, but that's neither here nor there. Moving along with the model's graphic design, we have here the side plate, another picture of the built model, a barcode, and just some basic verbiage on the kit's contents. Side panel contains the same type of format as does the reverse side. Before I crack open the box, I just want to point out that this kit here I purchased off of eBay, and it's a relatively recent addition to the stash. The model itself is actually pretty rare to come by. These old school Academy Minicraft white background kits You don't really see that many of them these days, which is kind of funny because back 30 years ago when they were being imported into the country, they were somewhat more prolific. This particular kit here I purchased anywhere between 15 to 25 US dollars, and these models generally fluctuating prices from what I've seen. Sometimes I've seen them go really low, and sometimes I've seen them go pretty high. I guess it depends who's selling it and if they think they have something that's really collectible on their hand. Now, outside of the curio aspect of just what the kit is and its box art and all, under the hood, or I should say under the box carton, it is just basically Tamiya tooling with Tamiya quality of detailing. So if you find one of these kits for a high price, but you're just looking for a simplistic M48A3 Patton to build, in that case there you might as well just go with the Tamiya one, save a little money, and get literally the exact same type of kit with the omission of having better decals. Well, enough of that. Let's go ahead and crack open the box to reveal the kit contents. Here you can see all of the kit's parts still wrapped in their factory sealed bags. All of the plastic is made in this olive drab type coloring. It looks similar to the ones found on Tamiya, but the color is slightly different. If anyone's built old school Tamiya kits, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about. Starting with the model's upper hull, here you can see the detailing now up close. And if anyone has ever worked on the Tamiya M48A3 kit, this piece here should look basically identical. I will say that for a copy, they actually did a really good job because there's not really a whole lot or any degradation found on the small finer details, which if anyone knows a thing or two about mold making, a lot of times when you make a copy of something, some of the details end up getting softer as the pieces are duplicated. But for this kit here, or in these older Academy kits, that's not really the case. You can see the inside. Other than these chatter marks here, these artifacts from the mold, the inside tooling quality is basically almost identical to Tamiya's. On this portion here in the back, you can see some factory markings, namely, if I can get down to focus, M48A3 and the old school Academy logo, which on their kits is that weird, strange looking font that they use with their language. From the upper hull, takes to the lower hull. And again, basically identical to the Tamiya. The only difference between the Academy and Tamiya lower is with this large hole that we have here in the center. On the Tamiya kit, this is not present, and I believe this is for the two-way wire remote wire to exit from underneath the vehicle. Even has the same battery indication location marks. And the gearbox bulkheads are slightly different compared to the ones on the Tamiya. I guess Academy needed to improve them slightly or adapt them for their own mold making process. By having these little columns here, it gives it a little bit more support and helps the material flow in. You do have this little belly button here, found on the Academy. I don't believe this is present on the Tamiya kit, but we'll see that momentarily. Digging down further, takes this runner that contains the running gear. Again, identical layout to the Tamiya kit. And here we have the rubber tracks. The tracks themselves are the same pattern as the Tamiya ones, but the material is slightly different compared to the rubber that's used on the Tamiya tracks. Either way, these tracks will be more than adequate for this build. Note the motorization section built into the sprockets, as well as the other lower hull fittings. Another runner that contains the other half of the road wheels, as well as the polycaps. Note on this kit here, the polycaps are this tan material, while on the Tamiya kits, they are generally molded in black. Also, you can see an old artifact from back in the day. This kit supplies you with 2 little tubes of mono glue. That is definitely not something that you see these days. It's always a treat when you find that. Moving along, takes us to the turret details. Again, basically nothing more than, oops, this bag's already open. Take this out. Here you can see the quality of the tooling. Literally identical to the Tamiya's. Only the tag here has been slightly changed, where the Tamiya one sticks up further. And here you have just that typeface, which Academy like to use on kits of this era. Just like with the Tamiya, the kit also supplies you with a small little bit of rope for use on the tow cable, but unlike the Tamiya one where the tow cable rope is a nice thick and to scale material, on the Academy it's this really, really thin black thread line. Pretty sure this will not be used on this build, but hey, at least they give you something, right? Moving down further takes us to this runner, which consists of the upper hull components. There go the bow headlights and fender mounts. And the last runner is the turret halves. Now on the Tamiya kit, there's actually some very fine cast texturing that is molded in. It's still somewhat present here on this tooling. You can see it in the light, but it's not as pronounced as it is on the Tamiya. Having said that, the Tamiya kit is actually pretty smooth itself and generally doesn't come out after a model gets painted, but it's just something to point out. And in the bag here, we still have some more parts. We have a little clear piece of film plastic for use on the searchlight lens. Now on the Tamiya kit, this was a thicker piece of plastic stock and actually had the lens itself punched into the material. So you just have to snip off two little locations and you have your exact lens to drop into the plastic part. On this model here, they just give you a piece of plastic and tell you to hack away at it. Also supplied, oops, sticking to the static on the glove. Okay. Also supplied is this little length of rubber tube, which is also found on the Tamiya kit. And this little rubber tube here is for the power cable that connects the searchlight to the turret. Tube itself looks to be adequately made. It's very similar to the Tamiya one, but I believe the Tamiya one might be longer, if memory serves. Finally takes us to the instructions. Now, just like everything on these kits, it is very, very bare bones and budget. And what Tamiya accomplishes in 2 or 3 pages, Academy does in 1. Double-sided printing, of course. Luckily, the kit's very well designed by Tamiya, so assembling it is very simplistic indeed. And on the bottom of the box gives us the decal sheet. Now, the decal sheet is very similar to the one found on the Tamiya, but it is much more abbreviated. The Tamiya instruction gives you some more markings, namely that mouth that is supplied with their kit to render a very famous M48A3. On this one here, you just get the marine markings for tank number C23. These are water slide decals. However, I've had some iffy results with these decals in the past. From what I've seen, the quality of the decals are actually on the poorer side and not really the best. They go on pretty easily, but they are extremely shiny, and trying to get them to blend in can be an issue, which was even seen on the box art like I showcased before. With the stock parts now out of the way, now I'm going to go into what I'm going to be adding to this build. First is with the decals. Like I said before, I don't exactly have a whole lot of confidence in these stock supply decals. So in their place, I'm going to replace them with a better set of waterslide decals here from Star. This was picked up off of eBay and gives you several different renditions to model the M48. These decals are much higher in quality compared to the original kit ones, and it will definitely go a long way to help the build overall. However, the changes that I'm going to make to the model are not going to stop with the decals. You see, another change I'm going to make to the model involves the lower hull, and that change will involve that bit of equipment. Just like with the M60s that I recently completed, where I converted those static kits to motorization, this model here is going to follow suit. You see, just like with the Tamiya M60A1 family, the Tamiya Patton M48 family is probably easier to convert to motorize as opposed to the M60. You have a nice wide open hull. The model was originally designed to be motorized, which means you already have the motorization equipment or the provisions for mounting the gearbox already integrally found in the hull, and the hulls are designed to come apart very efficiently. Well, just like with the other builds, I'm going to be utilizing the same Tamiya twin motor gearbox. Just like I frequently mention in these motorized conversion videos, the Tamiya twin motor gearbox is one of the best options available in order to do a conversion like this. The gearboxes are very abundant, they're very easily found, they're also very affordable when found, and they assemble very easy and pretty much effortlessly. On top of that, most importantly, the gearboxes are very nicely designed. Whoever designed these gearboxes really knew what they were doing. They are very strong, very robust, and with the way the gears are designed with their material and with the widths that are used, are more than capable of propelling one of these models for an extended period of time without the risk of any sort of gear strippage. Because the gearbox is dual motor powered, this also helps the life of the gears. The amount of wear and tear on the gears is diminished because the other track is being propelled by its own separate power source. With the dual motors, you do have ample power to propel this model, as well as possibly overcome any obstacles that it may come across. Another advantage about the dual motor system is that if you are clever enough, you can actually convert the model not just to be motorized, but to be fully radio controlled, which is something that has been done on YouTube on several other channels. And from what I've seen, many individuals utilize this exact same gearbox for this purpose, probably for the same reasons that I just mentioned. Before I actually start digging into this build and getting it started, however, let's go ahead and compare and contrast the Academy tooling to the Tamiyas. Starting with the upper hull. Here you can see the two side by side. Now keep in mind this model here was partially started by another individual, but you can still see the same quality in detailing that's found on the integral molded in surfaces. Note on the inside, here we have the Tamiya logo and information compared to the Academy. Here we have the lower hulls. Like I stated before, the Academy has this large open hole in the bottom. That's absent on the Tamiya with the way these things were molded. And you can also see the difference in the gearbox mounts that are found on the inside. Finally, here we have this runner over here. This is the Tamiya one and the Academy. And if you compare and contrast, the pieces look basically identical. Like I said, the only difference is with the little tab that was added by Academy. And you can even see the small little D, similar to the Tamiya one, but you again get the same exact idea. And here's the model now going through its assembly process. Starting with the lower hull, you'll notice that the swing arms have been added. Now the running gear is not going to progress too much past this point here because, like I frequently say in these videos, I like to pre-paint the running gear prior to the assembly, so these components will be fitted towards the end of the build. However, you can see that I actually added some extra detailing to the lower hull, namely with its cast texturing. The M48 series had its all cast bathtub hull, which was similar to what was seen on the M60 vehicle as well. On the cast texturing, I also added to the front section over here just so it's continuous and there isn't a break with the continuity once the model is fully assembled. On the lower section here, there's a small little, looks like a belly button type hole. It's a sink hole for the inner peg that's found on the inside. And part of the reason for the addition of the bodywork was to conceal and delete this sink mark found on this section over here. From here, it takes us to another modification, and that has to do with this small little axle hole that we have here on the tail. Now, on the M48 Patton, when the vehicle was originally designed, it actually utilized a small trailing idler, which emerged from this section over here to give some little bit extra tension to the sprocket. This was a carryover from the M47 and the M46 Patton. However, by the M48A2, the idler system wasn't really deemed to be necessary and was phased out. By the M48A3 builds, all of the trailing idlers were a thing of the past. However, on the torsion bar mount castings, the section for the trailing idler equipment was still present. What was done was a cover cap was simply mounted in place on this section over here. Now, what's interesting to point out is that on the Tamiya kits, and this one being Academy is really no different, the kit always has this small little hole that's integrally molded into this section. What's interesting is that I believe Tamiya must have somewhere had the idea to probably release another version of the M48 and recycle the lower hull so that they could have the trailing idler present. But for one reason or another, they just never got around to it and never did it. On all of the Tamiya pattern M48 kits, the trailing idler hole is really left in this incomplete state that we have here. When you build the model, like what I've done on this side over here, the torsion bar simply goes on, but the hole is still going to be viewable. Now, this is something I've always wanted to fix on these builds, so what I went ahead and did was I actually developed a cover cap for this section over here, and once it's fitted, it looks something like this. The cover cap itself is a new detail accessory set that I designed, and it's made from 3D print. However, unlike the other 3D print and cast resin bits that are frequently showcased on this channel, where those are posted on the eastcoastarmory.com website and are listed on the various catalog pages that are on there, this set here is not going to be one of them. And the reason is quite simple. The ECA catalog is really more or less custom tailored for larger scale models and accessories, such as parts in 1/16 or 1/6 scale. With this model here being 135, it's not really going to fit into any of those catalogs. So rather than putting it on the ECA website, I instead listed it on my Shapeways store. There I have other components that are available, from other 1/35 scale bits that I've tooled up in recent months to some other 1/6 scale parts that are just odd men out and don't really fit into the other catalog listings that are on the standard eastcoastarmory.com website. This set here is comprised of this fret, and this little runner has all the components on it. Now you notice that there are several on the one runner. With this one runner here, you can equip 5 M48 Patton vehicles. Now these are specifically intended for the Tamiya tooling kit, or in this case here, you notice it dropped directly in place on the Academy rendition, but these will also work possibly on the Monogram 1/32 scale Patton as well. Maybe a little tricky to get on screen, but you can see that the parts have their appropriate shapes to them, as well as their fastener locations. And if you look closely enough, you may even see two little holes that the fasteners are not located in, and this is directly lifted off of the reference material that I was using. The parts are best added before the last swing arm detailing is fitted. With the design of these Tamiya kits, it's all one cluster, and then you mount on the shock absorber here. And when it's in this format, though, it's easier to just drop the component directly in place. However, that doesn't mean if you have a built M48 and that hole's been bugging you for all this time, you can still add the component. On this side here, you'll notice I went ahead and just dropped it directly in place. To do so, it's basically done with the same procedure, but it's a little bit trickier with the tighter confines. Basically, what I do is I just snip the little stem off that would just drop into this section over here, so that the piece can then slide and mount in place. With the way the component is designed, there is a little stem that is integrally printed into the bottom portion, and because of this, it just plugs directly where it needs to go. These pieces clip off with just a regular clean cut snip and then mount to the model in less than a minute's time. As for the remainder of these plates here, they're not going to go to waste. They're going to be fitted to the other M48s that I have loitering in my collection. Outside of the cover cap, the next most obvious and major modification to the stock kit was the addition of the Tamiya dual motor gearbox. Here you can see the gearbox I showcased before, but now it is fully assembled and fitted to the vehicle. The motors obviously aren't mounted yet, and they just simply click in, and this is going to be done after all of the electrical work is soldered together. To mount the gearboxes onto these models here, it's actually a very simple procedure to do. In fact, on the M48, it's actually easier to do than it was on the M60, which by and large was a relatively simple addition as well. On the Academy version of the M48, I did have to make a slight modification to some of the internal molded rails that I showcased earlier in the video. Like what we saw before in the unboxing portion, there are rails that are molded into this section over here in order to mount a gearbox and have it adjustable with its track tension. Well, with this gearbox here, it was making contact with two of the rails on each side. With a Dremel and a high-speed removal bit, I went ahead and flattened or I should say I removed the portion of the plastic that was interfering with the insertion of the gearbox. Once those sections were basically removed, the gearbox dropped directly into place at its appropriate height. To make matters even more interesting, on the bottom portion here where we have this slot, which on the original gearbox would have been for the fastener mounting, there's actually two plastic columns that get glued onto the inside in order to square off a level spot for the gearbox. Oddly enough, I actually utilize those parts from the box in their exact same locations because once added, they are the perfect height for the mounting of this Tamiya gearbox. So the gearbox itself is sitting on that shelf, in combination of the rails, makes for a nice flat platform and a nice steady platform for the gearbox to mount to. For mounting of the gearbox, unfortunately with the way the Tamiya gearbox is designed, I can't utilize the original hole location found on the bottom here, so a new hole was fabricated. On the bottom portion here, I went ahead and turned this section of resin to the appropriate height and permanently glued it to the bottom portion of the gearbox. Once this was attached, this was now my mounting point, and I went ahead and drilled and tapped these two sections over here, so the gearbox is now bolted to the lower hull permanently via two fasteners. The two fasteners give more rigidity and more sturdiness to the gearbox and will prevent it from yawing, or it can prevent the potential for the gearbox to yaw if it only has one point of contact. Of course, when you do this, you want to take some very careful measurements to make sure that the gearbox is mounted in a nice, true, and straight manner. Otherwise, you run the risk of having the sprockets mounted in a canted manner, which can cause problems with the tracks once fitted. Another modification that I had to make to the gearbox were on these two sections here that emerge from the sides. On the stock unit, they protrude slightly more from the way you see it here, and in its stock configuration, they actually make contact with the side of the walls here, and it prevents the gearbox from being mounted. I quickly just ground off a little bit of material on either end, and it was enough to allow the clearance for the gearbox to drop directly in place. Also interesting to point out is that on the bottom portion here of the gearbox, there are these two molded in feet. These feet are so that you can secure the gearbox to whatever project that you're working on. On most of the other 1/35 scale motorized conversions that I've done, these feet get in the way and I usually have to amputate them. This is specifically true for vehicles like the M60. On the M48, however, that's not the case. The hull's wide enough right over here where the unit just drops directly in place, and on top of that, with the way the M60 is, or I should say the M48 hull is shaped, I can just butt the 2 feet against the rear wall here, and it's exactly where the drive shaft needs to be, so it helps it anchor it in place. While on the topic of anchoring, in addition to the 2 fasteners, I also went ahead and injected silicone into these 2 sections over here, which give it a lot more surface area and grasp the gearbox in a much more firmer manner, which will also prevent the gearbox from possibly wiggling loose during operation. Looking at the gearbox, the final drive axle is located dead center on the kit supplied final drive. If we compare that with the original static final drive drop-in, you'll notice that the motorized axle here is basically in the exact same spot as it was on the stock static offering. So the track tension on this model should be exactly where it needs to be once the model is fully completed. One final thing I want to point out is with the way the two hulls go together, and this also goes back to the silicone. When it comes time for installing the silicone, you don't want to have too much in this section over here, because with the way the kit's hull is shaped, we have this blade that descends down into the hull that helps hold it in place. If the silicone is too excessive in these two locations over here, obviously it's going to make contact with these two blades, causing problems when it comes time to mount the upper and lower hulls together. One other thing I want to point out with the upper and lower hull fitting is with the front section. You'll notice that it doesn't exactly close in a seamless manner. Now, this is specifically true for the Academy kit and is where it differs from the Tamiya one. If anyone's ever built the Tamiya M48A3, you'll know that when the hulls fit together, they fit together in a very precise and basically effortless manner. Well, on the Academy copy, one modification needs to be done to the bow section over here. If you look on this section, if I could get into focus, you'll see the center stem that emerges from the lower hull. Now, this stem is, of course, found on the Tamiya and is needed in order to get the two halves together, but one addition that this has over the Tamiya is a small little protrusion that we have right there. This little protrusion is what's throwing off the height of the peg and is making contact with the upper, preventing it from being clipped together in a nice, smooth manner. So, in order to improve it, all you gotta do, you just have to amputate this small little section off. With my clean cut snip, I'm going to go exactly where the piece emerges from the remainder of the stem, clip it away, and from here, the stem is no longer going to make contact with the upper hull. Once I squeeze on the poly cap, the upper and lower hulls will fit together in a much more precise manner that's going to be basically on par with the Tamiya. As the build is progressing, another bit of detailing that I'm going to address are with the sprockets. Now, with the sprockets, it's just like your Tamiya pattern, where you have the two halves with those little rings in the center, and the hubs themselves do not have their mud slits. This is pretty common, found on most 1/35 scale plastic kits for one reason or another. Now, like I said in many of my M60 videos, it's not necessarily inaccurate to have the unit here without its mud slits, because there was one or two subcontractors that were supplying these parts in that format. However, on this particular kit here, the Academy M48, you'll notice that one hiccup that it does have is with the center hub. If you can see that on both of these sprockets, there is quite a substantial sinkhole found in these two locations over here. This again has to do with the way the pieces were molded and casted. These type of sinkholes are not present, I believe, on the Tamiya tooling, and appears to be something that is more commonly found on these Academy clones. Now, to fix this, this is actually pretty tricky if you don't have the proper tooling. With the depth of the hub over here, you're not going to be able to just put a swipe of body filler in there and then polish it away. One, it's very difficult to actually physically put the material in there, but also it's even more trickier trying to level it off and sand away the surface. And then on top of that, you have the risk of causing collateral damage to the other fasteners that are molded on the inside. So because of that, I'm not going to go ahead and use any red body filler for this application. Another trick would possibly be with some thick super glue. You could just build up layers of that, and after a while, possibly this might fill in the gap, but this is, again, something that's a little haphazard. On this model here, I'm going to use a different format. It's going to be a little more technical with its repair, but it's definitely going to be one that will work regardless. To do the procedure, I'm going to be utilizing, again, my mini lathe. The center portion is directly in the middle of the sprocket, which is beneficial for using this type of machine to do this job. And also, with the way the sprocket is designed, you have this large stem that comes out, which gives a fantastic grabbing area for the 3-jaw chuck that I have here. Also, another benefit for using this machine for this purpose is with the amount of material found, there it is, with the amount of material found on this stem, it's nice and thick so that I have ample amount of material to work with. Now, to do the procedure, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take an 1/8 inch drill bit, put in my tailstock here, and I'm going to basically bore out the center portion of the sprocket hub. This is going to effectively eliminate the material that's in that section that the sinkhole is in. Once the hole is drilled out, I'm going to then take some plastic runner, snip it to a certain size, and that's going to be inserted in place, which will then seal off the hole and give a nice flat surface, which better replicates the hub as opposed to having that ugly sinkhole that's found present on the molding. Now, like I state in my other 1/6 scale videos that utilize the lathe, this is the type of procedure where you're going to have the machine tools. If you don't have the tooling to do this, and most people out there don't, honestly, you don't want to do this modification, because if you don't have the tools, you're going to run the risk of really screwing this up. To the point where, honestly, probably best just to leave the sinkhole in place as opposed to trying to deal with it with the procedure that I'm using here. Here you can see the sprockets now drilled out. And from this point here, I need to fabricate the plugs that need to go in their place. To do that, I need to look no further than the actual runner that the parts were originally molded onto. I'm going to find some dead sections of the runner to clip off and turn into the plugs. The runners themselves are great because the diameter of the actual runner stems are 1/8 of an inch, so they should be a perfect fit for the new replacement hubs that need to be made. All I need to do to pre-prep the runner is just with an X-Acto knife scrape on the either ends here of the runner rod, because there's some flash that is present on some of these runners. Just a little swipe or two is really all that's required. And then from there, with a pair of clean cut snips, I can snip off the two little lugs and then get them fitted. It's amazing how fast things can change in this business. These are the two sprockets that I just showcased earlier, but you'll notice they are now fully assembled and are, which you would think would be ready for installation, but that's not really the case. Starting with the sprocket itself, you'll notice I went ahead and added the mud slits that are found on the drum portion here, like I mentioned in many of these videos. But you'll also notice that this variant here looks different than the other version, and that's because this component here is not the stock kit original piece and is indeed a replacement. You see, the stock original component is right here, and you'll notice that there's a severe chip found on the sprocket tooth. I'm completely just as puzzled as you are as trying to figure out how this exactly happened. As we can recall from the previous scenes, the sprocket ring was completely intact, and it's not like I went ahead and put this component into any sort of peril with some machining process, but regardless, the piece is broken. So because of that, it's irreparable, and I wasn't going to be able to salvage that piece. Luckily, in my stash, I have another M48 Patton vehicle from Academy, and that kit, I went ahead and took the sprocket, which was the exact same tooling as this model here, and I made a mold of it. With the mold, I was able to make a resin casting that is identical to the original component. Now, because the model is motorized, I'm a little curious on how well this is going to actually work. Cast resin is not exactly known to be very robust, specifically for parts that need to be mechanical in nature. In the past, I have used cast resin replacement parts for motorized and radio controlled models that are in my collection, and by and large the cast resin does hold up pretty well and really was never an issue. However, those components were parts like road wheels and return rollers, and even an idler wheel too, if my memory serves. This is the first time where I'm utilizing this material for a drive sprocket, and this does have a little bit more importance to it compared to a road wheel. While a road wheel just, it just rolls over the track, for the sprocket, the teeth need to engage the track and actually propel the vehicle. So it is under a lot more force compared to something like a return roller. But with half the sprocket being made from the plastic, I believe that this should be strong enough for it to do the job without causing any issues. But of course, I'm going to be finding out, as will all of you, as the video progresses and when I take the tank out for a test spin. Well, with the replacement of the material, you'd think I'd be done with the sprockets, but that's not really the case, unfortunately. You see, I discovered some major difference between the Academy and the Tamiya rendition of the M48 kit, and again, has to do with the sprocket. Now, like I said before, there is that small little sinkhole that's found in the center, which was dealt with, but another issue pertains the rear side here of the sprocket. You'll notice on the rear portion there's this drum that emerges from this section over here. If we compare it to a Tamiya M48 drive sprocket, you'll notice that it is completely flush. Why this is relevant, or why Academy did this, was actually for a good reason. Keep in mind, the original M48 kit from Academy was released in a motorized format, and with this type of design, you have a lot more surface area to grab onto that hex bolt, or I should say that hex nut, which is used for the spindle. Well, on the Tamiya, they use that same design too, but if you notice on the Tamiya one, it's further indented inside of the sprocket. On the Academy kit, it emerges from it, and this becomes a problem specifically with installation on your final drives. Now, if you notice on the Academy kit here, there is this well that is found on the final drive, but I believe if I was to redo this again, I would take a Dremel and with a high-speed bit removal tool and amputate this plastic around this area. Because if you try to install the Academy sprocket to the tank, you're going to run into this problem. Here you can see the sprocket is now bottomed out fully on the final drive, but obviously, this is something that is way less than ideal. If I take the Tamiya sprocket and insert it on the opposite side of the model, you can see exactly how the part is supposed to fit on one of these vehicles. So obviously, some correction work needs to be made. To remove this material, I can't exactly put this in my lathe because of the frailness of the sprocket teeth. This will definitely just lead to the components breaking on me, and then I'm going to be definitely screwed. So rather than going with that approach, I'm going to have to do this a more primitive way, where I'm going to just amputate these sections here with my bandsaw, and then with a file, just hand file the pieces so they're nice and straight, and from there, the conversion will be completed. Here I have the amount of material that needs to be removed from the sprocket. Now, if you notice, I am going to leave a small bit of material emerging from the sprocket's body. This is to give me a little bit of a buffer so that I don't go too close with the blade and possibly cause damage to the sprocket tooth ring. Because this model is motorized, this ring here is going to be at the utmost importance for it to stay intact. Another reason why I want to leave a little bit of material, as if we recall from showing the final drive before, there is a slight indent found on the Academy tooling, and with this material still emerging, this will be able to mate perfectly with the well found on the stock Academy final drive. It's also important to point out that this procedure here is not mentioned in the instructions, so if you're working on one of these old school Academy M48s, you're going to run into this and it's going to catch you with your pants down unless you've seen this video beforehand. If/when you do run into this problem and you do not have equipment like a bandsaw or like the machine shop that I have, you can easily remedy this with just the use of a file. Granted, it's going to take longer and you're going to have to pay more attention not to damage the sprocket tooth ring, but the same procedure can be done in this format. Also, to point out, if you're building the model as static, less importance of the trueness of the cut is going to need to be exhibited, because once the unit gets slid onto the axle, it does hold it in place very well. On the motorized model, however, that's going to be a little bit more of a factor, because again, it needs to spin and spin true, and if this piece is cut in a angle, this will tend to have the sprocket have a bit of wobble, which is definitely not something you want on a motorized tank. Okay, so here you can see now that the sprockets have been modded, how much different they fit onto the tank. I went ahead and temporarily put some road wheels on, just so you can see the alignment of the sprocket with the road wheels. Of course, this is going to be very important once it comes time to fit the track on. But this looks like exactly where you want it. The next thing I wanted to point out is with the tank's turret. On this small little section here where the bottom shifts upward to make clearance for the rear bustle, there's a small little curved portion, and this is also true for the opposite side. On the kit, I noticed that when it came time to fit the upper and lower halves together, the bottom pan would bottom out on this section over here and would cause some slight fitting problems. In order to fix this with a needle file, I just went ahead and just went up and down these surfaces here on either side with a few passes. Once the necessary material was removed, the upper and lower hulls fit together in a much smoother manner. As an interesting thing to note, I'm not sure if the Tamiya counterpart needed to have this procedure done to it in order to get the two halves to fit together. It's been a little while since I've built one of those Tamiya M48A3s, so my memory's a bit hazy on that. On a similar note, on the Academy M48A5, perhaps this was also something that needed to have been done as well, as that kit is basically just an improved version from this tooling that we have here. Again, it's been a while since I've worked on my CM11, so I can't really say for certain if that was a procedure that needs to be made or not. But if anyone's watching this video and have either or all three of these kits, you might want to pay attention to that small little section over there during your build. It will probably help you get the turret assembled in a more efficient manner. With the model now fully complete, you get to see how the running gear is fully fleshed out. The components are completely stock and really were assembled out of the box. The one change that I made, of course, like I may have mentioned before, was the front axle here that runs from one side to the other is a brass rod. Originally, there were these two smaller plastic pegs that get glued in place in order to secure the wheels to the vehicle. But of course, since the tank is motorized, I replaced it with the metal rod because it gives it better support. Moving to the back takes us to the sprocket, and specifically to the sprocket on this side. As we can recall, the original plastic sprocket just mysteriously broke on me, so I went ahead and replaced it with a cast resin one. The cast resin one has been holding up extremely well. I've actually driven the tank periodically, and the sprocket seems to hold up and work without any problems. The sprocket's mud slits are way more visible now that the model is completed, and of course overall helps the look of the build. Moving along takes us to the tracks. The tracks on the model are the kit supplied units, and now that it's fully painted and weathered, you see how they look outfitted on the vehicle. Just like with the other post-World War II American tanks that are on this channel, I went ahead and painted and weathered the tracks in the same format, because generally this is how they would look on the real vehicles. Of course, the tracks that were used on the M48 are the same types that were used on the M60, where we have the internal metal skeleton that are overmolded with the rubber pads on both the interior as well as on the exterior. On the Tamiya/Academy tooling, you can see that the tracks are much more improved compared to the earlier released Tamiya M60A1 kit that came out a number of years before these kits here were tooled up. Like I mentioned in my M60A1 videos, the tracks on that kit are one of the weaker aspects of the model and are one of the details that really didn't age very well. However, on the Tamiya M48, however, that's not the case, and the tracks are very nicely done and hold up pretty well with age. Now, if you are the type of person that is building one of these kits in a static format, but for one reason or another want to replace the single piece track with something that's an individual link, AFV Club does have a set of workable track links out there that work very well on these models, and those for the longest time have been a staple and a go-to accessory for many individuals who build these kits. In my opinion, however, it's not really necessary, but it's one of those things that some people like to incorporate on their builds. In order to weather the tracks, the rubber sections are painted in black and then have the weathering added to give them that pasty look that you see here, which does mimic very well the sun-faded look that you would see on rubber tracks that have been used and have some miles on them. The metal sections are painted in a rusty metal, and on this vehicle here would consist of the end connectors as well as the center guide tooth hardware, which is exposed on the front portion of the track. On the inner portion of the track, you can see the skeletal structure that has been painted with its rusty material, and the rubber sections have been painted as well, along with the guide horns, which are again mimicking that rusty color. Before I depart from the suspension, one quirk I want to point out that's found on the Tamiya tooling kits, and it's also inherited on this Academy kit, involves the suspension's height, or really the height that the tank sits at. You see, the Tamiya kit does have a mistake where the tank sits higher than it really should. The reason why this error is present on the Tamiya tooling, or I should say as the way the story goes, is that when Tamiya went to study and take photographs of a real M48A3 Patton, the sample vehicle that they were studying was a vehicle that had the engine and power pack removed. Because of this equipment missing from their vehicle, the entire vehicle stood up taller than it would normally when it has its engine and power pack fitted. It's one of those little goofs that basically cemented this kit in its format that you see here. Now, if you're the type of individual that goes on the online forums like Armorama and Fine Scale, and you look up people who build these Tamiya kits and play with them further from what the out-of-the-box offering gives you, one of the mods that they make are to the swing arms as well as to the shock absorbers. They go ahead and remove some material in a few locations in order to adjust the height of the suspension here so that it sits at its proper height. It's one of those things that isn't really noticeable, but if you know Pattons, or specifically if you compare this kit here to some of the other newer kits that are on the market, you will see that the Tamiya one does stand up a little bit more compared to the other options. And perhaps it's one of those things that if you're looking for a Patton build and want to err more on detail fidelity, this is where the newer tooling kits are superior to this older kit here. For this build, however, the stock suspension height is perfectly fine. From the suspension takes us to the upper and lower hulls. Like I mentioned before, these sections were covered in cast texturing in order to improve the overall look of the build. Now that the model is fully painted and weathered, you get to see how the cast texturing really comes out at the viewer. Another benefit that the cast texturing has is that it does a very good job at concealing the seam here that's found on the front that conceals the fact that the upper and lower hulls are not glued together and that they can come apart. Keep in mind, because this model is motorized, you do need to get access periodically, or in case of an emergency, to the gearbox, and with the way the kit was designed, it was originally designed to have this feature. With the way the cast texturing is added, it just blends in that little seam here in the front to a point where, unless I point it out, it's not going to be very noticeable. On a similar note, on the back portion here, we have those really cool mudguards that descend from the rear fender and wrap around the rear taillight. This is something that's always been a pain for anyone who has one of these models and are making them functional, because obviously when you take the top off the bottom, these pieces here are just not going to hold up. One technique that I kind of perfected on the M60 was I went ahead and modeled these pieces that they're permanently attached to the rear hull, but visually they look like that they are still connected to the tin work. With this technique, this allows you to have the detailing of these pieces, but if I move the fender here, you can see that it is not connected with the upper, so it's at no risk of damage when you need to take the upper off for whatever reason. While in this area over here, I do want to point out the taillights, and this is another area where the M48 is improved from the Tamiya M60A1. On that kit, the taillight is just a detailless round cylinder, while on the M48 here, they actually have the cat's eye detailing integrally molded in. When it comes for painting them, just like what is standard on all American vehicles, the one on the left-hand side is painted red on top with the silver stripe on the bottom lens, while the one on the right-hand side is blacked out. So we have a small little drop of black paint added to the top cat's eye, and the silver remains on the bottom lens. Moving our way up takes to the travel lock. This is fully functional as per the kit, and it can not only open upward, but yes, the hinge mechanism here can also work. This is something that can easily be done with a soldering iron, but it's one of those things where you have to be very careful with because of the small little pegs that are found on these pieces here. You can easily damage or break them during the installation as well as during the melting process. If you are careful though, you get the piece to work in a fairly easy manner. Just like with the M60, the barrel can be positioned in its stowed state without any sort of tools or other modifications needing to be added. Moving along, the remainder of the kit's details are stock with nothing really much to mention. This now brings us to the front, and this is one aspect of these Tamiya M48 builds that can be a little tricky to some novice builders, and that involves the headlight clusters here found on the front. The kit's headlights are nicely rendered and detailed, and with the way they are designed, they are all separate pieces. So you have the main frame here, that consists of the brush guard as well as the light mounts. Then you have the lights that get mounted separately, and then in the back portion here, there's the main strut that holds up the brush guard, as well as this small little light that we have right here on the tops. These pieces can get a little tricky to a beginner builder because of the small nature of these parts. If you're using just your bare fingers and hands to assemble them, you may have a little difficulty with this, so a pair of tweezers might come in handy. Other than that though, the pieces do go together very well. Moving forward takes to the front hatch. Like I may have mentioned before, the hatch is fully functional, although it is easier to get access to with the turret removed. It just simply pops up and rotates out of the way as it would on the real unit. Moving along takes us temporarily to the fire extinguisher. Just like with all vehicles of this era, the fire extinguisher itself is painted in red for higher visibility. Again, this is a common feature found on US tanks of this period. On the opposite side takes us to the generator exhaust manifold. The piece again is totally stock. The only modification I did, however, was to drill out the end section over here with a small Dremel bit, thus improving the accuracy. Moving up from the hull takes to the turret. Just like I mentioned before, the entire turret was cased in my cast texturing in order to improve the texture look of it. Now that the model is fully painted in weather, you get to see exactly how much that texturing pays off. From the cast texturing now takes to the Gypsy rack, and honestly guys, this is something that I'm completely surprised how I was able to salvage and bring it to the condition that you see it here. You see, one problem that I encountered with this build was the Gypsy rack just had a hard time fitting together. It would fit together, but it didn't really mount to the turret in its appropriate location, which is funny because, again, it's just a copy of the Tamiya tooling. Perhaps this is something that changes when they went ahead and made it a clone of it, where the specs are slightly off, but off just enough to cause some problems, or if it's just something else that I'm missing. But I've built a few of these Tamiya pattern M48s in the past, namely the actual Tamiya ones, and the Gypsy racks went together without any problems. This one here, I encountered a little bit more resistance than I anticipated. During the construction, I had a hard time with getting the piece to fit, so I had the really big brain idea to hit the piece lightly with a heat gun in order so that the plastic will get soft so I can fit the pieces in a more efficient manner. And well, note to self, that was a mistake. And honestly, it's kind of a rookie mistake that I made. And it's one that I gotta stress as a cautionary tale: don't use a heat gun ever on a plastic model to try to salvage something or tweak something. It has some real dire effects to the point where you'll utterly destroy something. In the lower corner there, you'll see what the piece looks like now, and obviously when that happened, it was one of those holy crap moments. What am I going to do now? Because the rack itself is not something that looks relatively easy to repair or even fabricate. Well, unfortunately, the stock original one was toast. There's no way in how that was going to be salvaged. So the only option left was to roll up my sleeves and to scratch build a new one. And the one you see here is that. Honestly, again, it came up better than I could have ever anticipated, and the piece just looks great. The component itself does retain the kit supply components, which would include the two sections here on the side, or I should say the main sections that hold it together, as well as these two rear portions here that are the main guides on the rear. The remainder of the rack itself, such as the rods, which by the way are multiple different sizes, as well as the top and the ones on the inside, along with the vertical struts that we have here, are all scratch built out of metal. The rods themselves are wire, and the struts are made from pieces of thin aluminum that were cut and bent to shape. Honestly, I don't know how the hell I pulled it off. I really don't, because the piece looks absolutely perfect. I even surprised myself on this one, which is funny considering all the stuff I scratch build normally. On the real Patton, by the way, this is exactly how it does look. The thinner sections are just thin pieces of steel that are just welded in order to give the piece some more structure and also to prevent things from falling out. And it just, again, I guess it was just amused working with me, guys. It just came out absolutely perfect. So I'm going to count my lucky stars on this one, and definitely am appreciative of the final outcome. Moving on from the miraculously salvaged Gypsy rack takes us to the tow cables. The tow cables on this model here are a mix of kit original and replacement parts. What was kit original were all the major components such as the tow cable ends as well as the little clips that we see here. What was changed, however, were the materials that were used for the cables. The kit does supply you with a piece of string to facilitate this detailing, much along the same ways as the Tamiya kit. However, unlike the Tamiya rope where it's actually to scale, on the Academy one here, that wasn't the case. The kit supplied string is far too thin for it to be used in an accurate manner. In its place, I replaced it with a set of nylon string that was spare from some flavor of 1/35 scale kit from either Tamiya or Academy or what have you. Anyways, a good thing that I had the string on hand because it just dropped directly in place as with the way the kit was intended, and the rest of the installation went by problem-free. Moving our way upward takes us to the secondary antenna base here, which is integrally molded into the turret and replicates an MP65 antenna base. The base itself is adequately detailed to get the look and feel of the MP65. The only thing I added was a small little wire here, which on the real antenna base would be a rubber connector, which then the antenna would plug into. Trying to replicate that detailing in 135 is always something that's problematic, so like what is frequently seen on my builds, I just have the rubber section sticking up, which is a way you would actually see them on the real vehicle when the antenna would not be connected. As for the other antenna, this is just installed out of box with no other issues encountered. Only thing I did was with a little pin vise, I drilled out the little section here, making it deeper so that I can install my own metal wire for the antenna. Moving forward takes us to the power cable for the searchlight. The kit does supply you with this detailing, however, rather than keeping the kit one, I swapped it out with a length of thin electrical wire that I've used on several other of these Patton-based vehicles with the searchlight. This thin little silicone covered wire here does a phenomenal job in mimicking the power cable, but one really good advantage about it is just the controllability that you can have with it, where you can position it and mount it in a way that better replicates the real version. With the kit one, it's a bit stiffer, and this is also true for the Tamiya one as well. The tube they give you is a bit on the stiffer side, and it gives you a little bit more resistance when it comes time to help align and configure it in a position that would better replicate the real power cord. Moving forward takes us to the remainder of the searchlight. The searchlight itself, it's another one of those pieces of equipment that are improved on the Tamiya M48 kit compared to the earlier Tamiya M60A1. The piece itself is just overall better fleshed out, and one of the biggest advantages that this one has over the other tooling are that the handles are actually real handles as opposed to the M60 where it's just this amorphous shape that's integrally molded into the side. The internal detailing, however, is basically identical compared to the two. However, on this model here, you'll notice that I went ahead and made the searchlight in its covered up configuration. With this kit here, the kit does supply you with a clear lens for the interior section. However, the piece is far inferior compared to the quality of plastic found on the Tamiya. I could have fabricated a brand new lens if I wanted to. However, rather than going that route, I went ahead and went with a different avenue by modeling the searchlight with its tarpaulin fitted. With the vehicle that I chose, it has this really cool graphic here painted on the front, and this would not be possible if you have the vehicle with the tarpaulin not mounted. The tarpaulin itself is actually scratch built out of aluminum foil, which does a phenomenal job with giving you the look and feel of the canvas tarpaulin. All the little ridges and folds that would be found on the real piece are mirrored very well with the aluminum foil. In addition to the aluminum foil being used for the front and the sides, you'll also see that I went ahead and fabricated the retention straps that would go around the searchlight, as well as their buckle detailing found on these areas here. From the searchlight takes to the main gun. This component here is built completely out of the box. The kit does have a 2/2 barrel assembly, which is pretty customary on most tank model kits on the market. The seam was simply deleted with just a little bit of super glue and some sandpaper to give the result that we have here. Moving further now takes to the commander's cupola or mini turret, whichever way you want to look at it. The piece itself is built out of the box. It does have some very nice motion to it where it can independently rotate, as well as the 50 caliber can go up and down. The kit does give you the option to model the vehicle either with the 50 caliber mounted internally like I've done here, or you can also mount it with the field modded external M2HB. However, one common mistake that a lot of people make when they're building these Pattons is they tend to overdo it with the 50s. I know that seems ludicrous, but on the real vehicle, if the gun was not mounted on the inside of the turret, it was because they mounted it on the top portion. You can have one or the other, but sadly you can't have both. On this build here, obviously I opted for the internal version, where the spare 50 actually went on another build that actually I did a video on already. I think it was the Sherman Firefly, but that's neither here nor there. The quality of the machine gun itself, again, it's straight up a Tamiya copy, so the quality is decent for what it is. On the model here, the barrel end, of course, was drilled out, which is a typical feature that I do on these models. Hopefully it comes into focus on the camera. But another thing, or another modification that I made to this piece, however, is that I made the commander's hatch fully functional, which is something that can be done fairly easily on these kits. Basically, all that's required is with a pin vise and a small bit, I drill out the hinge section that we have here, and then use a small sewing pin to facilitate the hinge pin. Once it's installed, you'll have some very good motion or articulation of this piece. Moving our way to the paint and the markings, for the model's main color scheme, I went with a slightly different color palette that I generally use on my post-World War II, Cold War era American tanks. A common misconception is that all of the American tanks that fought during the Vietnam conflict all had this tropical olive green type coloring. Think of something like, for instance, the Tamiya box art, for instance. And that is generally how a lot of people like to render their Vietnam era vehicles. And that's not necessarily the truth. If you ever Googled up images of these vehicles in country and find real period color photographs, you'll see that the color palette was more diverse than you would originally anticipate. You had vehicles with the tropical color, of course, but you also had several vehicles or several examples of vehicles with the dark olive drab, which is generally seen on vehicles stateside or in Western Europe. You had other khaki type drabs that were present on vehicles as well. And then when the vehicle would weather and be exposed to different elements, you know, the effects would change the base color of them. And that's kind of the color that I have here. Oh, and by the way, that's not including the Marines. They have their own separate, chart of colors that you could paint for their tanks as well. But that's something for another video. For this one here, I went with a khaki type drab. I basically started with my dark OD that are seen on my other builds, and I added some washes to it to get this modulated khaki look that we see on this vehicle. For the markings themselves, instead of going with the kit supply decals, like I stated before, I replaced those with a set of water slide decals from Star. The Star water slide decals are awesome. They are worth every single penny, and they just really make the tank pop and make it look so much different from what the original kit does supply you with. Don't get me wrong, the kit markings that are contained with the Tamiya kit are pretty cool, but they are limited in that they only give you like examples for one or two types of M48 Pattons. With this decal set, this opens that up, and there are several options available, and there are a lot of really interesting color schemes, or I should say decal patterns, that are out there. This one here, it's kind of unique. It has this Egyptian type ankh painted on the side here of the turret. It's the 60s, guys. Things were happening back then. But this is, by the way, a real M48A3, and in addition to the ankh, it also has this really cool custom drawing that I mentioned before, found on the tarpaulin, found on the Searchlight. It's Snoopy on top of his doghouse over there, with the apt title, War is Hell. The quality of these waterslide decals are great. They don't have any tears on them. They go on without any problems, and they also contour very well with the various surfaces that are found. For instance, over here with the cast texturing, they were able to cope and contour extremely well with the texture without causing any problems. And the Snoopy painting here on the tarpaulin was able to fit and fold into all those little nooks and crannies found on the aluminum foil. Again, these sets are really, really cool. And the best part is I still have a ton of markings on hand, so chances are really good I'm going to be picking up a few more of these M48A3s, so I could just, flesh them out with all the different color schemes and different markings that are supplied on these sets. Another thing I want to mention with the markings is that this one here, I actually went ahead and used a slightly different technique for the way I adhere them to the surface. On my previous builds, for the lacquer that I would use to preserve the decals, it would be Testors, or I should say Model Master dull coat. And I've used that material on just about all of my models going on several decades now. However, with the news that Model Master is actually going to be terminated and they're not going to be in business anymore, I needed to find another solution for my decals. And for this model here, I actually went ahead and, well, at first I used Model Master to secure the decals in place, and they did work, but it left a little bit of room for improvement. So before I went ahead and filmed this, I actually took the model and I added with an airbrush another top coat of varnish over it. The varnish that I used was from VMS. The VMS flat varnish is awesome. I've used it already on a lot of builds that are going to be upcoming video releases, and it's worth every dime. This stuff is just, it blows the Model Master dull coat out of the water. I'm never looking back. That stuff is awesome. There's a good YouTube tutorial out there that shows how to use it. I followed the tutorial and the results are just stunning. I'm kicking myself for not using this stuff in the past. So these markings here, as you can see, they have the varnish that has been applied to them, and they just adhere perfectly. Granted, the Model Master stuff did do a very good job with it. It did adhere them very well, and it did remove any decal silvering on them, but I felt that with the addition of the varnish, it just really seals the deal much better than just having it with the Model Master dull coat alone. So this is actually the first model that we've seen here on this channel that has this new stuff added, but it's not going to be the last. Wait till you see the other models I got in the pipeline, guys. Trust me, it's worth every single penny. In fact, I got to buy more of it, but I wish he sold it in a larger volume format. So with all that out of the way, it's now time to take the model for a test run. Like we remember, the model is fully motorized. So if I take the turret off, you can see the interior. The model is powered via 2 AA batteries in this little quick connect little system that I have here. And if I want to, you could easily swap this out for a 9-volt if need be. But I've run the model quite often during the months since it's been completed. By the way, this model's been finished now for about 4 months or so. It shows you just how big my backlog is. And the model runs absolutely perfectly with just a set of AA batteries like we have here. The switch, like I may have mentioned, is wired in a way so that the model can go both forward and reverse if need be. And it just runs really, really smooth. The one thing that I do want to point out about the Academy model specifically is with the material of the tracks. The tracks are a slight bit stiffer compared to the material found on the Tamiya tracks, but that hasn't caused any problems with performance. The one thing that I have noticed, though, is that if you continually to run the tank, the paint will chip off the surfaces here, which can possibly hurt the look, but this is something that you're going to live with, specifically when you motorize convert a model. It's part of the territory, guys. There's no escaping that. And well, in my opinion, the juice is definitely worth the squeeze. Having a M48 A3 Patton like this in a running format is, well, a sacrifice I'm definitely willing to make. And by the way, it's not like there's going to be any permanent damage to anything. If the tracks paint decay to a certain point, I simply just remove the tracks, repaint and weather them, and remount them to the model, and Bob's your uncle. The vehicle is then fully restored back to its original condition. For the test drive, I'm going to go ahead and run the model outside. Now, of course, it does not look like Vietnam out here, more like Siberia or Belgium 1944, but regardless, we should be able to muscle through. The model can go forward and reverse, and that's facilitated by that switch right there, dead center. And only on this one, you notice the markings are a little bit more discreet than I did on the M60 that I did a little while ago. So, we're going to go ahead, set the camera down, and fire this thing up. As you can see, 135 just does not have the weight in order to overcome obstacles like ice. So, again, case in point, if you're going to go RC, you don't want to go any smaller than 1/16. Well, after a nice little test drive, you can see that the model did run, and it ran pretty well for what it is. The model speed was nice and controlled. It was not too fast, but it was not too slow either. Keep in mind this is an M48 Patton and not something like a Porsche 917. The model was very reliable in that I didn't throw any tracks, I didn't lose a wheel or have any malfunctions along those lines. Overall, it's a good little runner. It's one that I'm glad to have so I could take it out of my display cabinet now and again and have it zip around my floor. Where, by the way, like I stated before, is probably the more appropriate environment to run a model like this. Well, at the end of the day, I couldn't be any more happier on how this build turned out. The Tamiya M48A3 Patton kit is one of my favorite kits that have ever been released, and working on this one here was no exception. These models build very easily, very efficiently, and on top of that, like I've stated in a few other videos, the Tamiya M48A3 Patton is probably one of the easiest 1/35 scale tanks to convert from static display to motorized. And this now slides us into skill level and recommendations. Even though this model is the Academy release of the M48A3, I'm going to take this kit here and lump it in with the Tamiya one for reasons that should be, well, frankly, very obvious. Unlike many of the other builds that are showcased on this channel, where those kits are generally geared for someone who's an intermediate to an advanced range builder, the Tamiya Pattern M48A3 is really the exception to that, which may seem strange because this kit does have some nice details on it. Generally, kits that have some finer molded details tend to be something that a beginner might want to avoid from working on at first and build up their skill level towards. However, the Tamiya Pattern M48A3, that's really not the case. These kits can be tackled by a beginner, although with the caveat that the person should pay attention to some of the smaller details like the headlights and the Gypsy rack and things along those lines. But other than those small little areas to watch out for, these kits go together very well and fairly easily. Now, although this model here is a carbon copy from the Tamiya kit and is a straight up clone, the stigma about clones being slightly inferior to their original product is true. Although this kit here is basically identical in just about every way to the original Tamiya, there are some very small, minute areas where the Tamiya kit is superior. Things like the lens for the searchlight, the tow ropes, as well as the biggest one that may be an issue to some builders, which were the sprockets. Like we saw before, Academy added extra material to the sprockets that can add some complications to some individuals' builds. If you come across this and say you're a beginner builder, perhaps you might want to do the Tamiya kit before you tackle one of these. But by and large, these kits here are pretty much identical. And if a beginner can tackle one of these models, obviously an intermediate to an advanced range builder would have no difficulties at all in putting one of these kits together. These kits here build very well out of the box, but one advantage that they do have is that just like with the Tamiya M60 kit, they've been on the market for so long now that there is a humongous infrastructure of detail aftermarket parts that are available to the builder. You can find detail components that are made in cast resin, photo etch brass, as well as, I wouldn't be surprised, finding some parts made in 3D print. All of these components can be added to these kits here to further enhance them from what the stock original offering gives you. Aside from the surface details, another option that's available to the builder is one that I actually incorporated on this build here, which are the markings. The star decals are fantastic in their quality and are a great way to further enhance the model outside of what the kit offers you in terms of the kit supply decals. Unlike many other vehicles that are on the market where you're going to be restricted in the type of markings that are available, with the M48A3 that's not going to be the case. You see, both the US Army and US Marine Corps utilize this vehicle, and because of which there are plenty of options between both branches that are available on the aftermarket decal scene. So you can amass quite a large collection of these M48A3 Pattons and have no two of them really look alike. Which is fantastic news because these models here are ridiculously easy to find and when found can be had for relatively affordable prices. These models here can be found at just about any venue that carries plastic model kits, such as the usual online sources like eBay, Amazon, a simple Google search for instance, or you'll find them in the flesh at places like swap meets, model shows, hobby shops, or possibly even flea markets. Because they've been on the market for as long as they have been, it's not uncommon to find one in basically any type of condition, from new, fresh, mint in the box with the shrink wrap, to open but never started, partially started, or even fully completed. Any configuration you can imagine, you're going to be able to track down one of these models. And when found, expect the prices to be anywhere between 10 to about 30 US dollars. The kits, however, are far from perfect, and in some areas they are beginning to show their age. However, they still hold up very well with the modern competition, in my opinion. Bringing us into recommendations, first and foremost, I'm going to get out of the way. If you are a fan of the M48 tank series, or just a Patton fan in general, this kit here is beyond a no-brainer. It's low-hanging fruit. In fact, for the longest period of time, this was the only option available for you to have an M48A3. It wouldn't be uncommon to have Patton fans have the Tamiya M48A3 and the monogram M48A2 in order to complete their Patton collection. To add on what I just said, I'm also going to say that in current year, if you do not have at least one of these kits sitting in your collection in one form or another, you cannot call yourself a Patton fan. In fact, I will revoke your Patton fan status and take away your card if you do not have at least one of these kits sitting in your collection, either in your stash or fully built and painted sitting on your shelf. It's that much of a mandatory kit to have in your collection because this kit is just so ubiquitous. Along similar lines, I strongly recommend this kit for anybody who's a fan of American armor, post-World War II armor, Cold War armor, and last but certainly not least, anyone who's a fan of modeling the Vietnam War. And because this particular kit here is the Academy Minicraft rendition of the M48A3, this opens up another subcategory, which are people who build and collect vintage plastic model kits. If you have the Tamiya already in your collection, the addition of the Academy one is one that would make for an interesting conversation piece. Now, although there are newer tooling M48A3 kits that are currently on the market and are about to enter the market, one would be, of course, the M48A3 kits from Dragon, which, by the way, are superior to this kit in most locations because, again, you're talking about newer tooling and technology compared to the older tooling from the 70s. But the other one is also from AFV Club, which at the moment of filming this is not yet out and is still in research and development. Undoubtedly, though, I'm pretty sure that kit is going to be superior to the Tamiya one as well. However, one aspect that the Tamiya kit does have over both of those is one that I've actually mentioned in an M60 video that I did a little while ago, and that is the ability to convert this model from static to motorized. There is a small little group out there of individuals who like to take static tank model kits and convert them to fully radio controlled. If that's the type of person that you are, then you're going to absolutely love this kit because it is, again, probably one of the easiest models to motorize or possibly RC convert. The gearboxes drop directly in. There's ample space for a 2-motor gearbox, which is what you would need to RC convert the model. And you do have some interior space, which if you play your cards right, you can possibly be able to outrig the remainder of the RC functions. I've seen a few other people, by the way, that have RC converted to Tamiya Patton kit, so I know it's possible. And if you're good enough, in which they are, I've even seen them make the turret rotate and even the gun elevate up and down. All of these are huge benefits on the Tamiya Patton, and in this case the Academy M48 kit compared to its newer counterparts. And with that, that wraps up this model showcase video for this 1/35th scale M48A3 Patton tank. If you like this video, be sure to subscribe to this channel, where it's a great way to keep up to date on new posted content, being small scale model showcase videos like this guy over here, or the larger scale project update videos that frequently get posted to this channel. Another way to keep in the loop of new posted content is by liking us on Facebook. There, I have more photographs of this particular build, as well as the other smaller and larger scale builds that frequently get posted to this channel. Finally, don't forget to swing by eastcoastarmory.com for more 1/6 and 1/16 scale builds and detail components. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you guys again on the next one. Later.